Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kiana Nurse. I'm the Senior Program Officer of IDEA Programs and the Program Lead for the ACLS Digital Justice Grants Program. So welcome to the third webinar of our fall webinar series, which is called Data Ethics, Stewardship, Privacy, and Ownership. If you missed the first two webinars, one of which was a general information session about the program, and the second was a conversation with current and former digital justice grantees who have also served as reviewers in prior competitions, those recordings are available now on the ACLS Digital Justice Supplementary Materials webpage, and I'm actually going to ask my colleague, Katie Rice, to pop that into the chat for folks if they're interested in consulting those recordings. So before I introduce our very esteemed interlocutors, I want to quickly say a few words about the intention behind today's session on data ethics. Now, some of you may already know that back in 2023, we hosted a session on data ethics featuring archivist Lael Hughes-Watkins, who is at University of Maryland College Park, and Professor Kim Gallen, who is at Brown. And it was a really great conversation that outlined some fundamental frameworks around data ethics, as well as the kinds of issues that prospective applicants might find helpful as they sort of craft their application materials and talk about, how data shows up and how questions of ethics show up in their applications. The recording to that conversation, as I said, is still available on the ACLS website, and I recommend folks check it out, since so many of the points that we covered are still relevant today. But a lot has changed since 2023. And particularly within this current landscape, I think we all must think more critically about what it means to what happens to our data when we use specific platforms and tools, and the extent to which the ways proprietary tech may actually run counter to the stated values and ethos of a digital project oriented towards justice. And so the goal of this session is really to build upon the foundation that initial session on data ethics provided, but to also sort of provide a new set of considerations and critical questions that applicants should be mindful of addressing around data ethics within their application. So I hope you find the following conversation generative and that it inspires thoughtful questions, which we will take in the second half of today's session during the larger Q&A. So the first interlocutor I'd like to introduce is Zakiya Collier. Zakiya Collier is a multidisciplinary archivist, memory worker, and educator whose work and research explore archival practices that account for the material conditions of Black life and the role of cooperative thought in the sustainability of cultural memory. Zakiya is currently a 2025 Create Change Artist in Residence with the Laundromat Project, an adjunct professor at Queens College, which is a part of the City University of New York, and New York University, and the program director for Archiving the Black Web. We're also joined today by Yasmin Shores, who is a professor and director of data and scholarly communications at James Madison University Libraries. Her research focuses on epistemological justice and scholarly communications, data ethics and privacy, and the relationship between information access and power and privilege. So I'm very excited to sort of continue conversations that I've been having with these two folks that I'm very lucky to call colleagues and be in community with. And so as I get started, with the screen, I'm going to ask Zakiya and Yasmin to also introduce themselves in their own words and just provide a minute or two of context of the work that you do, maybe share some things that you're currently working on or questions that you're thinking about to get us started with the conversation.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Zakiya Collier. Thank you, Kiana, for this opportunity to be here today, as well as for the beautiful introduction. I look forward to discussing all things data, digital ethics with you all today. As Kiana mentioned, I am the program director for Archiving the Black Web, which is a newer program. We're in our first cohort of a web archiving school program, which teaches memory workers and community-based archives, as well as Black collecting institutions, folks from Black collecting institutions, how to web archive, how to do so ethically, and to use it as a tool in our toolbox to preserve Black history and culture. And I'm also teaching 2 courses this year, Intro to Archives and Information Activism. In both courses, really thinking about how to ground students in the communities that we are a part of as we think about sort of the theoretical underpinnings of the archival and library field, but also really thinking about how ourselves, our communities, and loved ones are impacted by the decisions that we make. And so how can we sort of use our skills as information professionals to make changes in our communities that we want to see. And similarly, with my residency this year with the Laundromat Project, using art to think about ways that we can sort of have more autonomous archival practices within our communities and homes and do so collectively. So working on a lot of different things at the intersection of archives, digital archives and data, as well as ethics.
Thank you, Yasmin.
Yeah, hi. Echoing Zakia's appreciation for being a part of this conversation here with all of you, and really looking forward to what questions you might have in the second half. As was said, I'm the director of a department in the libraries at James Madison University, which is a public institution in Virginia, dealing with data and scholarly communications. And some of the projects that I'm working on, though, that I think will be really germane to this conversation, I had been part of a Mellon-funded project talking about collections as data. So we were looking at, which Zakia is aware of, we're just looking at how we look at library and archive collections from a computational aspect, like what sort of considerations and projects can be done when you make those collections computationally available. So ethics featured prominently in that work. And in my institution, we also have a Mellon-funded project that is with the Furious Flower Poetry Center, which is the first and longest standing Black Poetry Center at a university in the United States. And we're in partnership with them in creating a living archive, and doing that very much from a community archives ethos, and have been working with great people like Lael and Shift Collective and others to really ground that project and serve as a model, aspirationally serve as a model for other institutions that wish to do the same kind of work. And we're built on that work as a sub-award with another project called AV Annotate, which is coming out of Tanya Clement's work at UT Austin, to see how one could add annotations to audiovisual objects. And we're working with Furious Flower Poetry Center on that as well. I'm serving as the PI for the sub-award, and it has brought up some really interesting conversations that are directly relevant to today's topic. And so I look forward to getting into that and speaking from that current experience with you all.
Wonderful. Yeah, as you were both giving your own introductions, I was sort of excited about the way some of the questions that we have created together kind of directly speak to the work that you're doing. And so one of the values that I've had, particularly in this, format of webinar where folks are in the field doing their work, but because they've also served as reviewers in prior competitions, they're able to kind of provide some insight from multiple directions on the same topic. So how would you articulate this in an application? And also, what does this look like in practice in some of the projects that you're working on or consulting on? So thank you for those introductions. The first question, so just to jump in related to some of the issues that you both sort of highlighted, I want to sort of introduce the idea of this politics of refusal that actually came up in the last webinar that we had with 3 digital justice grantees who have served as reviewers. And so in our last session, Gia Carruthers, who is a 2022 Digital Justice Seed grantee, highlighted how politics of refusal, so intentionally deciding not to collect data or to collect as little data as possible, or as is necessary for their project, informed her, how that politics of refusal informed her and her team's approach to data collection. And so not everything should be collected, not everything should be discoverable or accessible given the specific content at hand, as a sort of quick way of understanding that politics. And so their project, which at the time was called Decriminalize Survival, an archive of survival, is a community engaged digital archive project that was designed to illuminate a kind of submerged legacy of feminist resistance to interpersonal, but also carceral state violence. And so I wanted to start here because it's a clear example of how, a funded digital justice project took a very clear ethical stance around carcerality and surveillance and how that informed the grantees' approach to data collection. And so when we're thinking about this larger conversation of data ethics, I think it's important to start at the point of collection, right, of how we're going about even collecting our data. And so in your own work or even in projects that you've consulted on, can you talk about other examples of this intersection between, data collection and issues of privacy, surveillance, or preservation? How has that shown up for you?
Yeah, I can take a start. Going back even into work I was doing as a data librarian, right? Teaching data management. Ethics is always a component of that, and data privacy as well. And so you kind of, with that framing, you take the approach of sort of a risk assessment, and you think, at least I encourage those to think about, what is the relative risk of holding data across whatever the characteristics might be of your project, right? And then approach it with what is the least amount of data that I can collect, because generally speaking, the less that you hold, the risk will go down then to populations or individuals. I mean, this actually holds true across any kind of entity that you're collecting data about. It doesn't even have to be people, although that is certainly the risk that we're quite concerned about. So there's just a generalized best practice, if you use that terminology, to kind of turn away from the idea, like if I gather all the data I can gather about something, then I'll be able to do the most robust research and ask all the questions I want to ask and have the most complete picture I can have of whatever the subject is you're looking at. That's not really true, and a lot of times you end up with data that you don't really know what you're going to do with. So if you think about the various attributes of the data that you're collecting, really ethically, you must hone in on what are the fewest attributes that I really need to fulfill this outcome that I'm trying to get to, right? And tie it tightly in that way. And then you are really putting yourself in a better position to mitigate harm and to reduce risk that can occur with data that is collected without a good purpose, potentially with poor organization because you don't really know what you're going to end up doing with it. And so that's when you're collecting data, right? That's a very in the moment thing. If you're looking at existing digital objects and thinking about discoverability, right, and access, that's a little bit of a different approach, I would say. And I'll say a project that I was aware of had wanted to improve archival description of populations of Black Americans from the early 20th century primarily. for whom photographic records were poorly described, as far as individuals go. And they wanted to use computer vision and do some aspect of facial recognition to improve the models at that time that were performing very, very poorly on non-white individuals, to improve that kind of performance, let's say. And me and my colleagues, read through their proposal, and just felt like it was a poorly articulated kind of argument when it came to recognizing what the inherent risks could be to populations today, to improve archival, record description, um, with softwares that were not locally controlled, right? And so I think this is a case where the good intentions of improving a record, perhaps, and even you could argue creating visibility and representation and access to families and so on of these records, you really do kind of have a responsibility to at least think, well, what's the worst thing that could happen from this to populations, and really problem solve that all the way through. So you're at least describing it and how you would mitigate that harm.
Yes. So I would definitely echo everything that Yasmin has just shared. And I think just to build on this point around not collecting that data that you may not need, also considering if you are the best steward for that data, and the best long-term steward, even if you are the collector. Perhaps you are not also going to be the long-term steward for it. Maybe there are ways that the community members themselves could be equipped to be stewards, or there is somewhere else that or some technology that can be made available to them where they are the stewards, they are the ones that uh, manage access to the data. So thinking about ways that the participants in a data set are more involved in controlling what happens to that data after the collecting. But going back to thinking about if you are the best steward, it's important to think about context. And, many of us are coming from academic contexts where there is an abundance of digital storage technologies available, that are perhaps more available or less available in different under-resourced communities. However, thinking about the context and what that data will be in relationship with other collections and other materials at that particular institution or institutional archive, and thinking about ways to have that data set made available in other places or activated in other places, and considering, whether or not to even do the collecting based on if you are the best steward for that data. And I think in this conversation around refusal, a couple of things kind of came to mind for me. One, thinking about documenting the now, or Doc Now, which is a project that I've been a part of, which is around ethical social media documentation or archiving. And Doc Now existed as a sort of, has existed as both a place that creates tools as well as a community and leader in sort of the ethical conversations around whether or not, especially with data sets like social media, where people are still actively a part of the conversations. And, if the data is not anonymized or protected in particular ways, then there are ways that people can be targeted from the data that is collected or otherwise harmed. And so thinking about, the sort of minimum threshold for collecting, do you need to collect every tweet in that hashtag, or, are there particular parts of the conversation where you can sort of add additional hashtags to narrow down the data set, or are there particular individuals that you're interested in rather than the entirety of a conversation through the affordances that different social media platforms might provide? So do you need all the comments, a few comments? Do you need just the image? Do you need the person's profile, or do you need 10,000 profiles? And the answer is probably never 10,000 profiles. But it's important to sort of consider all of those things in that conversation. I think also related to the sort of politics of refusal, Dr. Tanya Sutherland's work also came to mind. And I'm thinking in particular her recent book, Resurrecting the Black Body, which is on race and the digital afterlife, and also the Feminist Manifesto, which she mentions in that text as well, which really goes through a list of refusals as it relates to data collecting and data management, because I think it is important to name perhaps where it's important for something to be collected, but perhaps it removes someone's autonomy to do so. Or perhaps, the folks that are involved in that data set will not be able to speak to it, or, sort of just have decision making in what happens to it. And that's not always possible in every data set in every situation, but things to consider sort of broadly in that conversation.
Thank you both also for citing different kind of resources that folks can consult after this conversation if they're interested in sort of learning more. One of the things, when I initially brought up this idea of how the politics of refusal came up in our last conversation to Yasmin, you had framed it as sort of collecting as much information or as much data as necessary, but not collecting everything. And I remember sitting with the feeling that, oh my God, that goes against my training, like as a historian, where you're constantly searching for as much as possible in the archive and sometimes sort of coming up against not having enough information or not having enough data. And as I was listening to, both your comments and Zakia's comments just now, it reminded me of how sort of when we're thinking about what justice looks like, at least in the context of this program, and the sort of ask to be a little bit more critical around how you're engaging with the sort of topic of inquiry at hand at your project. I do think the projects that have been really successful, or the ones that have been funded, kind of go beyond a kind of liberal notion of justice that just stops at inclusion and really interrogates like what that means, right? And so I appreciate that the sort of the distance between a politics of inclusion and a politics of refusal is really that risk assessment, right? Of like being included into what and for what purposes. And so that provides, I think, a really good segue into some of the comments that you just shared, Zakia, about sort of thinking about the ways that certain pieces of data collection can impede on folks' autonomy, right? And so where does that practice of collection sort of sit, especially as we're navigating different spaces of like academic institution spaces, and then like working with community partners. And digital justice projects often have to navigate what I think is that somewhat contentious space between those different sort of actors. And so can you offer any insights or advice on like concretely how to do that, like how to sort of design projects that are intentional about where ownership of project data and outputs resides and why, and sort of you listed some considerations in terms of whether or not you're the best steward for the data that you collect. But I'm wondering if you can share any additional thoughts on that, and Yasmin as well.
Yeah, so yeah, around this question of thinking about, sort of transparency about your data outputs and making that widely available, it made me think of a collections as data project, like Yasmin mentioned, that I was a part of, that involved sort of turning an oral history project into linked open data. In order to sort of visualize and understand the relationships of jazz in central Brooklyn, from the 1930s to the 1960s. And sort of in conversation with some of the participants who were oral history participants who were still with us, sort of one having to kind of debut this technology of like, okay, here is what is linked open data. This is how it works. This is how it exists in other places in our world. Here is, I'm based in Brooklyn. So here is New York City's open data portal where you can kind of go and see other like data sets that exist. Throughout the city that may or may not be relevant to you. You may or may not be included, just based on how the data is collected and, what involvement you may have. And sort of being in this like pedagogical mode initially of like, before I can ask your permission to do this, I need to make sure you feel informed about what I'm asking to do with your oral history interviews, not transforming them in any way in the traditional sense or changing your words, but extracting sort of the relationships from these oral history transcripts and kind of saying, where someone says, we grew up together, I can, at the bare minimum, say these two people knew each other, these two jazz musicians knew each other, or these two jazz musicians were friends. And which, in a larger scale, we're able to build a visual model to say, these artists knew each other. This person grew up with this person, was influenced by this other person, was educated by this person, and so on and so forth. But beginning in a pedagogical place of making sure that, any folks that may be participants understand what they are signing up to do. And then sort of and also sort of making sure they understand that the digital outputs are going to be in multiple places. In this case, this was a collaboration between Weeksville Heritage Center and the Semantic Lab at Pratt Institute in their information department, and wanting to make sure that they understood that this was going to be different places and in Wikimedia or in Wikidata, and publicly available, but not saying anything outside of what was already in the oral history transcripts. And I mean, the sort of resulting outputs kind of live digitally in those different spaces, like on Weeksville's website, within the Semantic Lab, their servers. It's on Wikidata. It's linked from the Collections at Data website, and anywhere that they may have shared that information elsewhere, and sort of almost like in our main page for the project, kind of creating this sort of linked data or like hyperlinking of like, these are all the places that you can find it. They are all connected to each other. They may present different parts of the data, but this is how they all communicate together. They're on GitHub, they're here, they're here, they're here. And making sure that there are multiple ways that people can access the data and use the data based on different skill sets and reasons for wanting to view the data. If it's just, I know I'm included in it and I want to know what's going on, or even if I'm not planning to use it in any particular way, or I want to check for, I'm someone who's critical of this project and I want to analyze this data for myself. But making sure there's multiple access points and types of accessibility, considering the different types of potential audiences and users that may want to view those outputs.
Yeah, I've put a link into the OSF site where we've got like the project output for Weeksville in there under cohort 1, and others that I might reference in this session. I think in addition to those considerations, I also want to really underscore, what Zakia was talking about is essentially like the informed consent aspect of this, and that it's important to write out, I think, document the expectations and responsibilities of um, of the research team and anyone that's in that partnership or in that collaboration, so that there's unambiguous shared understanding, and to not, I think it can be easy to forget what people who are outside of your immediate domain don't know about practices or institutional practices or research methodologies. And so I think to like explicate that as much as possible is really critical to do this work, to do this work period, but particularly if you're applying a justice framework to it. um, I think that you should consider in your research plan um, the time that it takes, if you are doing something in a co-creation model, right, with a community. What is that time that it takes for you to both understand one another and to co-educate one another on things? Of course, there's like obvious things like maybe terminologies, but again, like the methodologies, the practices, um, something that I think can happen for those of us that are, we're doing a lot of our work in an institutional context, um, is a sort of inertial approach to a paternalistic over-reliance on standards and methods. And so having flexibility when you're working with communities, in particular, on a project together, or you're working on a topic or a collection that concerns a community, have some flexibility in your approach. I'm not saying, I come from a librarianship background, I have a science background. These are domains that have a lot of methods, a lot of standards. We have, entire profession is classification. But I'm not saying that those are irrelevant and not important, but depending on the nature of the work that you're trying to do, you should allow for the possibility that you might need to augment them or be flexible with their application, in order to center the human, right? Or to center the population. So I think that I have seen that can be an uncomfortable space. I think it's an uncomfortable space for a researcher who has a reasonable identity as an expert and has cultivated that expertise and applies that expertise to research domains. But I think that is also, Kiana, you're saying, like, this is against everything I know as a historian. uh, I think for many of us, the ways that we were trained in a domain are being really challenged by the current digital technology landscape and socio-technical situation of the United States and beyond, honestly. So I think that we must recognize where that flexibility, that openness to, okay, at least what would it mean to use a different way of description here? What would that really mean? What are the actual ramifications of deviating from the standard that my domain holds? You might find out if you think that all the way through that it's not that you know essential a change, right? It won't somehow make your project unusable or not have value to your peers and to the community. So I think those are things that take time. So that's my biggest thing is when you're embarking on this work and you want to have that expansive view and that operate within the justice framework, you must allow for the time that it takes to interrogate the processes and the systems that we've relied on for years.
Yeah, I had two quick thoughts, and then I'll sorry to jump ahead of you, Zakia, just to let people know that there is a recording of a session I hosted last year with Andre Brock, where we talked about operationalizing digital justice projects. And the biggest thing that came up was time, right? Of just having to navigate different bureaucratic, red tape. And also just like the different sort of ways we move through time in academic institutions versus working with community partners and having to kind of reconcile the tension between those two things. And because, feasibility is a thing that reviewers look for in projects, that is something to be really mindful of, that things will just take longer than you perhaps anticipate. So I wanted to flag that resource for folks if you want to watch that recording. Zakia.
Yeah, just something that came to mind as Yasmin was speaking and thinking about this sort of the ways that things will have to change at some point. There will be something that comes up. Life, everything is unpredictable. I think one thing to also consider, especially as you're pursuing a digital justice project and naming justice as a value, therefore, and naming ethics as a value, I think it could be really useful to also continue down that train of thought of identifying project and individual project team members' values and how those will be used to sort of make decisions when things do need to pivot, rather than sort of having the bureaucracy will do what it will. Um, Community does what it does. The administration does whatever it wants to do. And so understanding your values and where you are willing to make changes, where you aren't, where something is actually altering the value system of your project as opposed to altering the methodology for getting there. And like what is bendable, what's not, is important so that you don't have to try to do that work mid-project and you have something to point back to as a way to make those decisions, to decide on what types of tools you want to use and being able to say, these are our values, this tool does not represent that. If we're going to go against that, we are making an active decision to do X, Y, Z and documenting how and why that decision got made that was, in opposition to the pre-identified values. And I think in addition to that, I think what sparked that initially was Yasmin mentioning sort of this understanding of what each person is responsible for and what each person has access to, and like what is responsible for managing and like very clearly laying that out. And I wanted to add thinking about the for how long, as well as like contingency plans. Like, contingency plans, like, jobs are not always permanent. Um, and, you know, like, contingency plans, as well as like contingency plans, as well as like contingency plans, like, jobs are not always permanent. And Yeah, but just thinking about how long someone actually wants to be responsible for that thing. We can be committed to our projects and dedicated and love them so much and still say, I do not want to be the steward of this data for the next 20 years of my life. So, like, let's figure out, you know, how this is a shared responsibility, or, what are the ways that it rotates, the roles rotate or the responsibility rotates, who's, the direct contact for the particular storage. Solution or whose email address, is attached to it. And making these as like very clear decisions that are documented and named.
Yeah, I really love that point. And I was just thinking about how this is a session on data ethics. And yet we're also kind of talking about these operational sort of portions of the projects because it directly kind of ties into that. And so one of the, big problems, so big that there have been many commissions, ACLS has had one itself on kind of thinking about the sustainability of digital projects, right? And so one of the things that this program particularly looks for is projects that are thinking in creative, but also project-based ways about the issue of capacity building and how that's tied to sustainability. And so I very much encourage people to think about that as kind of an ethical practice, right? Of thinking about how labor is distributed amongst your project team, thinking about successors and succession planning, right? If the data that you're collecting is near and dear to you, but also, runs the risk of falling into the wrong hands for whatever reason, thinking about what your project is gonna look like in the future and who will be the stewards of it after you, I think is a useful and important and ethical, right, exercise. But I want to switch gears slightly. This is somewhat related to what we were just talking about, because I think at least in 2025, it's impossible to talk about data ethics or privacy without talking about the elephant in the room, right? Which is AI. And especially as more and more folks are both interested, I think, in using, large language models and agentic AI, but also as there are more and more financial incentives to do so, as kind of not only tech companies, but also universities are kind of shifting resources in that direction, right? This, I think begs the question of like, what happens actually to data after it's collected and uploaded to these platforms? That the data is used to train these models, but like, what does that actually mean? And then what, right? Then the question is, then what? And so I'm wondering if you can both share sort of 1 to 2 just considerations that folks should keep in mind with respect to how they articulate their sensitivity or navigation of this reality in their application, because of the kind of rapid pace that these things develop. And also, I think the kind of competition between these large competitions in terms of churning out the latest model, it's kind of hard to get a sense of concretely how some of these things work. But I think beginning the question around, these are some things you should look out for, and this is how you could talk about some of those unknowns in your application, is a good place to start in terms of this topic, right?
Yeah, control. Yeah, yeah. I will give my best attempt for today's answer about AI. So I mentioned this program, the collections as data work that we did. We created a lot of documentation, but one of those documents were the Vancouver principles for collections as data, which were just a series of principles that were community informed to help stewards, mainly of digital objects, digital collections, think through different things as they conduct their stewardship. And certainly one of the things we put in there was that these collections would be used potentially for AI harvesting, AI training And what are the implications of that? If you have it open to the web, what are you implicitly sort of allowing to be done with them? And so, this is it's an interesting moment and shift in my field, at least, which 15 years ago was all like very jazzed on open everything, um, lots of little quips about knowledge, freely disseminated and available to everybody creates a more democratic globe. And I think there's, a recognition in this moment that that technologies exist now where you don't have to transform a digital object into another format to make it computationally available, right? It is available as it is, natively digital, for these language models or different types of training data, to be used in ways that you cannot anticipate. And there are a lot of conversations occurring about, is the right approach here mediated access, right? Do you create something that doesn't just allow immediate access, but you have to have some kind of authentication or some kind of request to view? Possibly, right? Do you put a statement? Do you put a right statement in there that forbids it? I mean, that really is the honor system, in my opinion. So, like, not really gonna prevent harm in that case. But it is part of that conversation, I think, is what we've been talking about, is that your collaborators, your partners should all be in conversation around the values that Zakia was talking about, around what are unintended, what could be unintended uses of the outputs of this research project, for example. What are get someone on your team that's really good about thinking about the worst. That's uh I say that's my superpower, is I look at a thing and I'm like, hey, here's what the worst person in the world could do with this. Now, how do we design against that, right? It's just a form of design thinking that's like worst case scenario planning. You plan for the worst and you design your system so that it's very difficult to achieve that. And I think depending on where you sit in your project and your view of the technology, what could be done with AI could be a worst case scenario. So this was a situation that actually was working with Furious Flower Poetry Center on their last conference. And we have a very standard sort of release because all of the conferences, they happen every 10 years and they've all been recorded. And so that's a lovely, collection over the decades, to see this evolution and growth and these wonderful speakers. But then somebody was like, but what if someone takes my image and does like a deep fake with it? And, that's the level of concern that exists, right? Like, is this recording? Like anytime you've got something recorded now, every time you're out there on the internet in some way, there's this, threat that people perceive of something can be done with this against my will. And so, ultimately it's like, well, we cannot guarantee that such a thing would never happen, right? What we can do is say, this is how this is going to be made available. And these are a lot of conversations that we've had, because I'll be very honest with you, as the director of the Poetry Center, Lauren Elaine, and I have had many conversations where the way we were talking about this project in August of 2024 and the way we were talking about this project in February of 2025 is significantly different. And the kinds of ways we are thinking about access and the kinds of ways we're thinking about the tension between historic visibility and what is American poetry, you know, and what is easily findable and that kind of stuff. And I'm not being hyperbolic on this, like literal individual concerns for safety, health, employment, reputational risk, because these are poets, these are their words, they're intrinsically a part of who they are. You know, this is a real generative and evolving conversation that we're having. So I really have to say how important it is that you've already done good work to talk about your values, to build that relationship, so that when the unexpected, perhaps for something happens, you're able to have those conversations in a space that is productive, authentic, and humane. Hope that got to it. We went from AI to humane, but that's it's all a piece of the arc, I think.
Yeah, I share all of those sentiments. And I love being the worst case scenario person on any project. But we need those people who are going to, um, yeah, n- propose the worst case scenario, but also do a deep dive into what may not be like visible at a first glance with these technologies that we interface with and use. And so I think Yasmin, I think you covered really thinking about what happens to um, the data that we may collect that is outside of our project scope, that, it just happens because it's available online, it's open source. Um, I think I will speak to sort of the use of AI within projects, even though I have not myself had the pleasure or displeasure, whichever it may be, to to use AI in a digital project, but I think just from generally understanding and having explored using new or different technologies, um, and the example I'll use is Yasmin mentioned Shift Collective earlier, which is a collective that I work with, and we're at the end of a 3-year research project on exploring decentralized storage technologies um, through for community-based archives, and like what are the possibilities that can afford these organizations to be able to sort of create um, smaller networks, storage networks that are sort of outside of larger institutions, that are independently managed and more autonomous and sovereign, and reflect the values that these institutions hold. But sort of at the outset of this project, which is funded by the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web, um, really thinking about all of the connections that these particular technologies have in the world, and some of the ways that they are impacting the world around us. And so where it may, you know, speed up a project by 3 months, or um, it may offer a particular way to approach and analyze the data when we maybe dig more deeply into some of the people that work at the organizations that create the tools that we may decide to use. We may realize that some of the decisions being made, or some of the people that are making the tools, hold oppositional values to what our projects purport to do, which purports to sort of have a justice-oriented approach. And if your project, for example, is sort of looking at decriminalization, but a tool you're using feeds data to law enforcement, you're kind of not on the same page. Your technology doesn't align with your project values and goals. And so for us in our project called Modeling Sustainable Futures, we had to do a year of research of really digging into the technologies themselves and how they operate, how where they get their money from, which are not fun questions to look into when you've already kind of like got your heart set on using a particular thing, and then you find out all of these sort of ways that they are connected to things that contradict your values or contradict even your identity and personhood. And yeah, having to make hard decisions in that way. But I think that is an important consideration, especially when working with marginalized or over extracted communities' data, and not sort of proposing that this project will make new revelations or preserve their history in a particular way, while also putting them directly closer to something that they are perhaps wanting to be away from. And if like decisions are made to continue with a particular technology where there are known sort of conflicts of values, I think needing to do the due diligence of communicating to the communities that this is a decision that's being made and this is what is known about that, so that especially if the data collecting involves sort of an agental process of someone, again, back to informed consent, making sure that people are able to consent to being a part of a data set that will then be used in a language model or agental AI that will, yeah, perhaps put them in harm's way. And so I think in that statement, and I think in addition to kind of thinking about worst case scenario as far as harm, potential harm or misuse, having a really good understanding, especially in today's context of in our worst case scenarios, we should even think about things that perhaps are illegal, because not everything that, not us doing something illegal, but the ways that the data could be misused and the ways that people could be harmed are in ways that might not even exist in our current imagination, but could be a reality, and not in our imagination because we see it as like, that's illegal. It would be illegal for someone to take the data and do that. And it's like, yes, and people do illegal things all the time. Or people do unethical things all the time. And illegal and legal and ethical don't always mean the same thing at the same time. And so considering that as well, when we're thinking about our worst case scenarios for either interacting with AI tools ourselves or the potential for our data outputs to come in contact with AI tools post-project.
Thank you for both sharing those considerations. I definitely don't want either of you to feel like you have to provide the answers for people, because we're I think we're in a moment of all collectively trying to keep up with everything and find answers to things. And so this is also why I think with folks doing this sort of process documentation is so critical to share out sort of like the challenges, the limitations, the kinds of conversations that you're having to sort of provide a way forward for folks interested in doing this work. So with that, I am going to open the floor to questions for the folks in the room, with the caveat of saying, if you have any general questions about the Digital Justice Grants Program, I would ask that you email those to our inbox at digitaljustice@acls.org. But any questions that you have related to the conversation that we've had this afternoon, related to the larger topic at hand of data ethics, we welcome those. Absolutely. You can pop those into the chat, or you can also raise your hand and sort of, share your question. I'm actually going to stop the